Funding for this program is brought to you by Bismarck Big Boy. From pizza burgers flying style to fast and delicious fried chicken, Bismarck Big Boy has been a local legend since 1954.
Experts say that your biggest connection to memory is your sense of smell. And my mom always said to me the two smells that she remembered from the grocery store were spices and oranges.
The Logan and Reed families both arrived in Bismarck in 1876. The families were in the grocery business and provided a much-needed service to the Bismarck community. Austin Logan established Logan's Grocery in 1877 with only $200 to his name. In 1915, Austin's son Roy bought the business from his father and built the present-day Logan building in 1917.
From the research that I've done, I found out that his real name was James Austin Logan, but so was his father, and so they chose just to call him Austin Logan. And he arrived in Bismarck in 1876. He was only 21 years old, and he didn't have a lot of money at the time, and he started out briefly working in a restaurant. Then he opened Logan Grocery on 3rd Street in 1877, and their slogan was, "We thank you." That was their slogan throughout the whole time it was a grocery store. He also was one of the original members of the Pioneers Association of Burleigh County. In 1881, it was a very busy year because they ended up building a new building on the site of the original one, and that's also the year that James Austin Logan married Lucinda McCulley, and that was March of 1881. And he passed away in October of 1916. I just recently, for the first time ever, saw a photograph of her. One of my friends actually found it and sent it to me, and it had Lucinda McCulley and my two great aunts in it. I don't know much about her other than the fact that she was very active in the Presbyterian Church. She was one of the first members of the Presbyterian Church, and also was very active in their women's Presbyterian ladies group. I think that I'm really proud about Logan Grocery because they did some things that other grocery stores didn't do. For example, they furnished the steamboats down at the landing with breads and pastries and provided groceries for Fort Abraham Lincoln. Also, their livery service, or dray service, if you want to call it that, they transported freight to the Black Hills during the expedition, including the Custer expedition that went there. Also, my great-grandfather was one of a group of men that came from Bismarck and went to with a whole bunch of wagons and a dray service to take provisions to Custer at the Little Bighorn. My mom told me that behind the grocery store was where the livery stables were, and they sold horses and cattle out of there. But one of the things they made a great deal of money on was a great big Percheron horse. There was a big dray horse that they studded out, and they were able to get quite a bit of money from that stud service. Before refrigeration was common, of course, ice came from the Missouri River to keep the perishables cold, and one of the other families in Bismarck that was big in that was the Wachter Company. They did lots of ice off of the river and would deliver it. So Logan Grocery had a great big huge walk-in kind of a vault type of an ice box, my mom told me. It was in the back of the store near the butcher shop, and that butcher shop was there so they could cut meat to order. Again, very sometimes unusual in a grocery store to have its own butcher shop. Then there was a fire in August of 1898 that destroyed most of the store, and the city insisted that any of the buildings that had been burned in that great fire would be rebuilt with brick. Austin Logan's son then, whose name was Roy Prairie, bought the business from his father in 1915. And then he constructed the present-day Logan building in 1917, and it remained in that location on 3rd Street between Main and Broadway until 1941. One of the things that they did that other grocery stores did not do is they came up with a bakery system that they could have right in their grocery store, and it was called the Barker Baking System. And it was part of the grocery store, but if you look back into the records of Bismarck's early bakeries, a lot of them followed that same system that had been set up by Logan Grocery to use inside their grocery store. In those days, it was sort of like what it's happened to become after COVID now, where you can order your things to be delivered at your house. Well, in those days, people charged. They didn't pay at the grocery store or anyplace else. And bills then would be sent out to customers, and they would pay them on a monthly basis. So as the store continued to get bigger and bigger, after my great aunt Irma joined the store, she worked doing most of the things having to do with the ledgers and the money and sending out the bills and so forth. So after she graduated from high school, she joined the firm or the grocery store. My long line of Bismarck High goes all the way back to my grandpa Logan. He was born and grew up in Bismarck. He did all of his schooling here and graduated from Bismarck High School in 1910. My grandpa Logan was a member of the Masonic Lodge and also of the Elks. But one of the things he was very proud about is there's a Rotary Club here in Bismarck that he was one of the founding members for and was the secretary and treasurer for that and short-time president for that Rotary Club. Shortly after my grandpa Logan took over the store was when he married my grandmother, Fern Reed. And as she entered into the family, she also became the vice president of Logan Grocery. My grandma was a very small woman. She was only 4'11", and she used to always say to me when I was growing up that she was 4'11" and shrinking. She was also active in a club called the Mothers Club, which is still actually in existence, and was lived to be one of the oldest members of the Bismarck Order of the Eastern Star. So, as you recall, I mentioned that her family was involved with the Burleigh County Pioneers, so she was also involved with that, and was a charter member of the Bismarck Girl Scout Council. The thing I liked about Grandma is that she didn't ever hesitate to tell stories or sing songs. She had some little ditties that she would always sing, and she always had these little, I suppose, learning experience kinds of things that she would say. She was really quite a character. My favorite story about my grandma and things that she did for the grocery store have to do about a holiday treat. And this took place during the Christmas season. And my mom and her two siblings would crack pecans and walnuts. They would get a penny a pound for cracking them. And then my grandma would salt and roast them with her special little recipe. And then they would sell them at the grocery store for a special holiday treat for people coming in. That lasted throughout my childhood. My mom always made the pecans. I don't remember the walnuts, but we used to have salted pecans for a little treat at Christmas time, and I loved them. My mom's name was Mary Lucinda Logan Vadney. My mom worked on Saturdays in the store when she was in high school. And one thing I found out that I had never known was that while she was working at the grocery store, she would also make trips to the drugstores nearby and would fill extra things that people had on their list that weren't in the grocery store. So in other words, to please the customers, not only did she round up the items that they needed for health care, but sometimes she'd pick up prescriptions for them from the drugstore. My mom has filled me in most on what it looked like because I never saw it as a grocery store. It was closed 10 years before I was even born. But my mom said that in the basement there were supplies and a canned inventory like often you would have in a basement, sort of a pantry area. She said the upstairs had displays of fruits and vegetables, and then there were great big bins behind the counters that held everything from cookies and in bulk to candy cases and so forth. One of the things that I've learned about in my life is that experts say that your biggest connection to memory is your sense of smell. And my mom always said to me the two smells that she remembered from the grocery store were spices and oranges. People have said many times that Bismarck probably had more grocery stores per capita than most, but as Bismarck grew, so did the competition. More people came in and became grocers, or the stores that sold everything in those days. So the person who was the owner or the proprietor of that store had to work hard. They had to keep a high profile, and they had to keep their customers. And my mom again told me, because I only saw little glimpses of this with my grandpa, really how hard he worked, and that he would come home for dinner and he would, the store would be closed, but he would come home for dinner and then later go back to check the sales for the day. When my grandpa was still healthy, when I was younger, there's a few things I remember. I remember in the basement, the office where he would sometimes work in the evenings. Even though he wasn't running the grocery store, he would maybe have the minutes to do for the Rotary or something, and he would go down there. That's where the laundry chute came out, was in that room. And I'm sure my brother has fond memories of climbing up and down the laundry chute from top to bottom when we were kids. But I also remember, one of the things I really remember that I said to my dad one time, I can remember Grandpa must have been pretty tall. And because I remember there were these trays above the registers that you would open. There were metal trays, and you would fill them with water, and that would be what would bring humidity throughout the house. Well, he had this great big thing that looked like, your typical gardening thing, only like great big huge thing to fill with the water. And so I thought he was really big and strong and everything. And of course, my dad said he wasn't even 6 feet tall.
Help tell the stories of Bismarck's past and become a financial sponsor of this program. Contact info@bismarckhistory.org to learn more.
Again, I'm pretty proud of my grandfather because after he retired in 1942, he did service for the community for pretty much the rest of his life. And the most important position that he received was to be on the Burleigh County Selective Service, what we call the draft board. He served there for 18 years on that and was several years its chairman. And for that position, he had been recommended by the then governor, North Dakota Governor Fred Ondahl, and then from there was appointed to that position by President Harry Truman in 1948. He also served as a businessman on the City Zoning Commission and Special Assessment Board. When my grandpa started to get ill with emphysema, I remember him sitting most of the time in his recliner. In those days, one of the things that I found very interesting that they did for people who had trouble breathing, they made these big sandbags, and the sandbags would go on his diaphragm. So when he was laying in the recliner, he'd have this sandbag on his diaphragm to help push the extra carbon dioxide out and help him breathe. My grandpa died in September of 1966 at the age of 74. I was a sophomore in high school, and my brother was a senior in high school. It was only a few months later that my grandma and grandpa would have celebrated their 50th anniversary in 1967. Again, just like his father, there were several pallbearers that were really big name people here in Bismarck. Dr. L.W. Larson, who actually lived in the house next door to my grandparents, George Bird, Charles Whitty, Evan Liff Sr., and Frank Hedden. This interesting side story about my dad was that during high school, he actually worked for a rival grocery store, and that rival grocery store was Economy Grocery. And I think it was right in the same neighborhood as Logan Grocery. And my dad always said there was competition, but he said, but amongst the grocery stores, there was always also cooperation. He said that even though people worked very hard to keep their regular customers, that when it came right down to it, the stores worked together, and what their intent was to provide a good service for the people of Bismarck. As far as the Logan building is concerned, I only remember the building as a rental property. When my grandma and grandpa were older, and then after my grandpa died, there was a business on the main floor where the grocery store used to be. Then there were apartments up above, in the rooms up above. And I just remember when I was pretty young, going with grandma down there and helping clean out the apartments when somebody would be leaving, and we'd be trying to get it ready for a new tenant to come in. I think because I never knew the grocery store, really, in essence, my memories of my grandparents revolve around their house. And their home was at 221 West Avenue B. It's still there. So it was in between Washington Street and Mandan Street. Well, I grew up at 828 Mandan Street, so we were only about 3.5 blocks away from my grandparents. That means a lot to me that I got to know that set of my grandparents. That particular house was actually originally built in 1919 and was owned by Ed Lahr, who was eventually a mayor of Bismarck. And as I can recall, there was probably never a time that there wasn't at least one card table that was set up. And Grandma would play a lot of solitaire, or she'd try and talk people into playing gin, or I learned canasta from my mom, so I'm sure that she learned it from her mother, but there was always a card table set up there. And during the holidays, of course, it doubled as having a puzzle on it or something that people were putting together. So anyway, that kind of became my favorite place to go when Grandma and Grandpa would host Christmas dinner, and there would be people there that I didn't even know who they were. But I can remember going to the sunroom after eating, and all the adults were probably taking a nap. And I would curl up with a book and on the floor where there might have been a little ray of sun, and I would read, and then, of course, fall asleep in the sunlight. And I remember that. That side of the family, I had to do a little bit of work to really look at some of the things that my mom had written down, because I only knew little bits and pieces. So he arrived in Bismarck in 1883, and his beginning of a business actually started from the time he arrived. And I sometimes joke that groceries must be in my blood, because he also had a grocery store. It was called H.L. Reed and Company Groceries and Meats, and it was located somewhere on 6th Street, and it also was very successful. But he also got into politics a little bit more. He was a city treasurer for 2 years, an alderman for 12 years, and a member of the legislature in 1901. Then the thing I guess I knew most about was he was a very active member of the Firemen's Association and served as their secretary for many, many years. And he was the first volunteer fire marshal or fire chief. And the name of their company was the Bismarck Hose Company No. 1. And their hose company building was located on 4th Street. There were a lot of prominent men that belonged to that volunteer fire department. One of the big branches of the family was the Wards, and their patriarch was a man by the name of William Oscar Ward. He was actually my mom's great uncle, and he came to Dakota Territory after the Civil War. And what happened during the Civil War was that all these men, joined to help fight a war, and they wanted to get out and retire and be paid their pension. And the United States government said, sorry, we don't have enough money to do that, so you have to stay in long enough to go out to the Indian wars and stay in Dakota or some of these other territories. So he ended up out here. So the Wards put their roots down on a ranch at the bottom of what's called Burnt Boat Road now, where Ducks Unlimited is right now. The Wards built the road to town. So from there all the way to Avenue C, it was called Ward Road. Only part of it is now called Ward Road, but it was because William Oscar Ward cut the road to town so they'd have a way to get in. How the Logans and the Wards are connected is that my grandfather's sister, whose name was Eleanor Logan, married a man named Milan Logan, or Milan Ward, excuse me. And I actually knew him. I met Milan when I never met Eleanor, but I met Milan because that's a farm that my dad and I would go out and ride horses at. Their sons, I should say, Milan and Eleanor's sons, Bob Ward and Logan Ward, even though they probably would have been, I would say, second cousins to me, because they were really my mom's cousins. We called uncle, so we called them Uncle Logan and Uncle Bob, and each of them had their own farm, like I said. I like the idea that when people ask me about my background here in Bismarck, that I can say, well, do you guys know where Logan's on 3rd is? And I used to be, I could just say Cafe or Roma and everybody would know what I was talking about. Now that that's more of an office building, it's a little bit different. But they also have put a new sign up on the corner of that building that says Logan's on 3rd, on the southwest corner of Broadway and 3rd in downtown Bismarck. And I'm pretty proud about my roots in Bismarck. I can tell people my great-grandfather and grandfather's grocery store was right in the heart of the downtown, and it keeps that legacy that my grandparents gave to me really quite in the forefront of my mind. And having a lot of roots here in Bismarck really makes me proud, and I'm glad that my grandma and my mom and my dad took the time to tell me some of the stories about my family.
Help tell the stories of Bismarck's past and become a financial sponsor of this program. Contact info@bismarckhistory.org to learn more.
I asked Pa, I said, what do you think Riverwood, Pa? Do you think that'd be a good name? So I submitted that name and I won it.
Remember when the Capitol burned, I looked out and there was this black stuff going by the window.
The president of Woolworth at the time's name was Kirkwood.
My parents decided, I think my mom decided that Bismarck needed a zoo. So